Section 14 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Civil War, Battle of Pharsalia, Death of Pompeius, Death of Cato, Part 1. The tribunes had quitted the city on the night of January 6th, 49 BC, revised calendar. The consuls thereupon convoked the Senate in the temple of Bellona, which lay outside the walls, in order to enable Pompeius to attend their meeting and virtually to control it. Their favoured leader had attained the object of his ambition. The Republic had thrown herself at his feet. New levies were commanded throughout Italy. Favonius petulantly urged him to stamp his foot and evoked armed legions from the soil. But the wary veteran determined to leave in Spain the large forces which he had collected in his province, to act as a check upon Caesar in his rear. Both he and the chiefs of his party still clung to the idea that their foe would be betrayed by disaffection in his own ranks. They were aware, perhaps, that his lieutenant Labienus was about to desert him, and they hoped that many others would follow his example. They were still convinced that the clouds of danger would disperse, and assigned magistracies and provinces among themselves and their adherents, with reckless disregard even of the due forms of law. But Pompeius continued to make preparations for a lengthened conflict. Arms and money were collected by forced contributions. Italy was placed under military perquisition. Her temples were rifled of their treasures. The report of these tumultuary proceedings reached Caesar at Ravenna, where his plans were already matured. He harangued the soldiers of the single legion which he had there with him, explained his wrongs to the full satisfaction of their blunt understandings, and called upon them to draw their swords and hasten to redress them. On the morning of the 15th, he sent forward some cohorts to the Rubicon, the frontier stream of his province. Throughout the day he presented himself at a public spectacle, invited company to his table, and entertained them with his usual affability. At sunset he made an excuse for a brief absence, and hastened with a few attendants to overtake his soldiers. The Romans signalized the famous passage of the Rubicon with various reputed marvels, but the act which decided the fate of Rome for so many centuries was quickly and quietly accomplished. On the morrow, the proconsul of Gaul appeared in arms before Ariminum as an invader of Italy. The Gauls were marching upon Rome. The frontier garrison opened its gates in terror. It was here that the tribunes met him in their flight from Rome. But what should have detained him 10 days on their journey does not clearly appear. From these quarters Caesar issued his orders for the movement of his troops. One legion reached him within a fortnight, another in the course of the next month. For the moment, however, his whole force was hardly 6,000 strong, while his opponents had at least 3 times that number actually in hand. But Pompeius, it seemed, was struck with consternation, together with all his party, at these rapid movements. They were, after all, taken by surprise and utterly unmanned. The proscriptions of Marius, the slaughter of the Aelia, the burning of the city by the Gauls, such were the horrors that seized on their imaginations and unnerved them for the encounter. Pompeius betook himself to the Appian Way, and magistrates and nobles streamed through the gates and pressed after him to the southward. His forces, he declared, were unequal to the contest. Let all good citizens follow him to a place of security. At Capua he halted, and there it was found that the consuls had carried away the keys of the temple of Saturn, but had left the treasure of the state behind them. Pompeius bade them fly back and fetch it, but they hesitated and asked for an escort. He could not spare a man. The gladiators in keeping at Capua required a large force to watch them. It was not till these dangerous swordsmen were broken up into small parties and lodged in security that the 2 legions which kept guard over them could be utilized for more active service. Meanwhile there was some pretense at negotiation, but Pompeius, encouraged by the defection of Labienus, insisted that Caesar should lay down his arms, while Caesar no less peremptorily demanded that if one surrendered his command, the other should do likewise. But Caesar advanced. Arretium, Iguvium, Auximum promptly received him. The road to Rome lay open to him. But when he heard that his adversaries were crossing from Capua to the upper coast, he turned to the left and threw himself on the strong central position of Corfinium, where Pompeius had left a detachment to hold him in check. Domitius Ahenobarbus, one of the boldest and most sanguine of the party, had insisted that this place at least should not be abandoned. But to leave it unsupported was equivalent to abandoning it. Domitius preferred to stand a siege, but his soldiers delivered up the place to the assailant as soon as he appeared before it. Domitius himself fell into the victor's hands, but Caesar well knew the advantage of making a signal example of clemency, and not only spared the captive's life, but allowed him his freedom also. Politic as Caesar's forbearance was, it accorded doubtless with his natural temper. Barbarous as he had shown himself in contest with the enemies of the state, he was always sparing of the blood of citizens. He could be not forbearing only, but generous. The beaten soldiers joined his standard with alacrity. The people of the country flocked around him. They were dismayed by the proclamations of Pompeius, who threatened the severest measures against all who assisted or countenanced his enemy. Cicero, who was deeply mortified at his chief's abandonment of the city, murmured with disgust at these impolitic menaces. Pompeius charged him to relinquish Capua, where he had been entrusted with a command, and join him in Apulia. He was loath to withdraw further from the city, and the road, it seems, was no longer open. From Lucaria, Pompeius led the consuls and magistrates to the port of Brundisium. There he had already secured a number of transports, and from thence he immediately dispatched several legions to Epirus. To remain himself behind and embark with the last of his division was the only duty of a general that he consented to perform. Caesar, hastening from Corfinium, was already at the gates, but he was destitute of vessels, and the sea was open to the transports which were returning to bear away the remnant of the fugitives. He made a vigorous attempt to throw a mole across the mouth of the harbour, but in this operation he was baffled, and Pompeius effected his escape. The situation was now completely reversed. Pompeius and Caesar had exchanged places. The government of Rome had emigrated to a foreign shore. The assailant reigned supreme throughout Italy, and had only to show himself in the city to be received with acclamations. The senators, at the bidding of their champion, had thrown themselves upon the support of subjects or strangers. While still possessed of large armies and abundant resources in the west, they had preferred to secure their position in the opposite quarter of the empire. They carried with them all the levies which they had made from Roman citizens, with several complete legions, and were accompanied by the great mass of the ruling classes, the knights and the publicani, whose pecuniary interests were bound up with lands and cities in the eastern provinces, and they demanded aid from all the dependent sovereigns who lined the frontiers of Greece and Asia Minor, the petty kings of Thrace, of Galatia, of Cappadocia, and others who could furnish ample military supplies, as well as dense crowds of well-equipped though ill-trained warriors. They were protected, moreover, from any sudden attack by a numerous fleet, which, after transporting them across the Adriatic, could guard the passage against the assailant, should he threaten to pursue them. Caesar himself was utterly unprovided with ships or maritime resources. The great naval powers of the Mediterranean, Rhodes, and Egypt were attached by special bonds to the interests of Pompeius. he had not calculated on having to pursue the Senate on the ocean. Nevertheless, the moral weight lay on the side of Caesar, and this soon appeared to be preponderant. The flight of Pompeius was viewed with disgust and alarm by a large section of his own supporters. Cato took the same step only as a frightful necessity. Cicero shrank from it and returned to Rome to abide the progress of events. Many senators and other men of consequence followed his example. Public men and magnates who possessed a stake in the country were terrified at the violent language of the fugitives, who threatened to return as conquerors and tyrants. Pompeius was wont to exclaim, "Sulla could do this and that, why should not I?" Sulla had brought his legions from the east and made himself dictator by massacre. His pupil and successor might do the like. Confiscation, plunder, and proscription were in the mouths of his most rabid followers, such as Bibulus, Favonius, Labienus, and Lentulus. Nor was the state of things secure at Rome itself. The government was dissolved, the consuls and higher magistrates had fled from the Forum, the laws were in abeyance, and a reign of anarchy seemed impending. The domestic warfare of the debtors and creditors, which had so often brought the Republic to the verge of ruin, which had been arrested by the overthrow of Catilina, and with difficulty kept under by the authority and the armed forces of Pompeius, was about to blaze out again. Every day of the interregnum was fraught with infinite peril. Caesar was not in a position to pursue Pompeius, but had he been so, it would have been necessary for him to abandon the pursuit till he had secured the basis of his power at home. He had driven his enemies out of Italy in 60 days. He now turned promptly back, crossed the Apennines, and presented himself almost unattended in the city. The people, high and low, received him joyfully, for he brought them the pledge of security, at least for the day, and they had almost ceased, through their long period of anxiety and despair, to look forward to the morrow. Thus possessed of the centre of his enemy's position, the conqueror might determine more at leisure on which wing of their forces he should first throw himself. In the absence of the civil magistrates, he could only impose a military government on the city, and this was cheerfully accepted. A large donative gratified his soldiers. A liberal gratuity to every citizen delighted the populace. But he carefully abstained from private spoliation for the discharge of these sums. He bethought himself of the treasure which the consuls had forgotten to carry away, and ordered the temple of Saturn to be thrown open to him. Lucius Metellus, one of the tribunes, was on the spot, and had the courage to interpose his inviolable person. Caesar pushed him scornfully aside. He addressed the people, reminding them that the precious store was reserved as a sacred deposit for repelling a Gallic invasion. It was believed to comprise the actual ingots of gold which Rome had paid to Brennus as the ransom of the city, and which Camillus had wrested again from the barbarians at the point of the sword. "No fear henceforth," he cried, "of a Gallic invasion. I have subdued the Gauls." But the Pompeian party had yet another weapon in store which might make the position of their adversary untenable. The nearest granaries of the city, Sardinia, Sicily, and Africa, were all held at the moment by their own officers, while Egypt itself was very closely connected with their chief and his interests. Caesar's first care now was to establish his power in the neighbouring islands. A legion which he promptly dispatched to Sardinia was received by the inhabitants with open arms, while the garrison of the Senate was ignominiously expelled from it. Cato, who had charge of Sicily, was obliged to abandon his post as soon as Curio appeared in sight. Africa still remained to conquer, but Curio, when he transported his forces to the continent, was encountered by the Pompeian lieutenant Varus, with the Numidian chieftain Juba at his side, and was routed and slain. This important province was thus left in the hands of the Senate. but the immediate needs of the city were now adequately supplied. Meanwhile, Caesar, having left Rome in the keeping of Aemilius Lepidus, a noble of high position, whose descent and connections attached him to his cause, and the Italian peninsula under the command of his devoted follower, Marcus Antonius, had set off in person for Spain. "I go," he said, "to encounter an army without a general. I shall return to attack a general without an army." The 3 Iberian provinces were held by good and veteran soldiers, but were commanded by Varro, Afranius, and Petreius, a man of letters, a man of fashion, and a stiff regimental officer. Caesar might hope to dispatch them all quickly, but he was detained by the defection of Massilia, which lay on his route, and now shut its gates against him at the instigation of Domitius, the same Pompeian officer whom he had so recently spared at Corfinium. This important city held, as it were, the keys of the Transalpine province, of which it was the principal emporium. It was necessary to reduce it at any sacrifice of time and resources. But Caesar left 3 legions to invest it, while he passed by it himself and pushed on, crossing the Pyrenees and throwing himself upon the Pompeian forces which held the line of the Ebro. The events of the brief and spirited campaign which followed are told in the concise and nervous narrative of the conqueror, who succeeded, after suffering great hardships from flood and famine, and displaying singular ability and fruitfulness of resource in reducing his opponents to submission. The Pompeian soldiers for the most part took service under him. Once more Afranius and Petreius, with their principal officers, were allowed to go free. From Ilerda, Caesar marched swiftly southward, and easily brought Varro to terms at Corduba. There he found a store of treasure already accumulated for the campaign against him, and returned from his adventurous expedition, reinforced with fresh supplies both of men and money. The Massilians made no further resistance. Domitius escaped and rejoined Pompeius in Epirus, and added another element of rashness and violence to his noisy and discordant camp. But Caesar had effected the reduction of the West. At this moment he might have declared himself the acknowledged sovereign of one half of the empire. End of section 14. Section 15 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Civil War, Battle of Pharsalia, Death of Pompeius, Death of Cato, Part 2. During his absence, the citizens at Rome, inspired by his influential agent Lepidus, had proclaimed him dictator. Some of the prescribed forms had indeed been omitted, but little care of legal forms had been taken in many recent elections. The dictator had been created, it seems, by the praetor, in place of the consul, with the acclamations of the people, and not by the suffrage of the Senate or the Curies. It was better, however, that the commander of the legions should rule under a known historical title than with none at all. The people, who saw the odious power of a dictator wielded at last by a champion of their own, rejoiced in the master whom they seemed to have themselves chosen, and forgot for the moment that Caesar ruled by the army and not by the voice of their comitia. It was for fiscal measures which brooked neither delay nor weakness that the appointment of a dictator was demanded at this crisis. When, in the middle of the 7th century of the city, the feudal laws against usury had been suffered to fall into abeyance, a consul was found to carry a sweeping law for the reduction of all debts by 3/4. The money-lenders who demanded interest from 12 to 40% exclaimed loudly against this confiscation of their property, but it was impossible to maintain the government except by such violent enactments from time to time. Nor indeed did the money-lenders of Rome suffer permanently from these arbitrary measures, any more than the Jews suffered from even harsher interference with their gains in the Middle Ages. The spirit of luxury, growing with the greatness of the empire, gave fresh impulse to their transactions. Large classes of citizens were lying overwhelmed by the weight of their obligations. Among the various interests evoked in favor of Caesar's schemes, none were more attached to him than those of the debtors and repudiators. His hereditary connection with the party opposed to the noblest and wealthiest classes, his reputed familiarity with Catilina, his own early embarrassments and laxity of principles entailed by them, all pointed him out as the destined leader of a great fiscal revolution. But the anticipations thus formed of him were deceived. Assailed by clamorous importunity, the dictator, absolute as he was, refused to yield to the cry for confiscation. He appointed arbitrators for the valuation of debtors' property, and insisted on its sale. All he required of the creditors was that they should forego their claims for excessive interest. He seems further to have resorted to the old expedient of the tribunes in distributing grants of land among the bankrupts and relieving the state from the dangers of a needy aristocracy. The chief measures of Caesar's dictatorship included a liberal distribution to the wants of the poorer citizens, the revocation of the enactments of Sulla which had condemned even the children of his victims to civil incapacity, and the concession of citizenship to the inhabitants of the Cisalpine. At the end of 11 days he abdicated his office, but he caused himself to be elected consul together with his now declared adherent, Servilius, for the ensuing year. The actual consuls were suffered to retain their nominal magistracy to the close of their legitimate term, which was at the moment expiring. Nothing was henceforth wanting to the regularity of his government, neither the decrees of his Senate, for he had assembled more than one half of its members at Rome, nor the election of the people, nor the sanction of the Curies and of the auspices taken on the spot appointed by religion. Caesar, as proconsul, was a rebel from the moment he quitted his province, but as soon as he became a consul, lawfully installed, the right seemed to pass at once to his side, while his adversaries were transformed into enemies and traitors. This they themselves tacitly acknowledged, for numerous as they were, influential as they seemed to be, they dared not enact a law, nor hold an election, nor confer an imperium. The representative of the people had become the guardian of usage and public order, while the champion of the oligarchy derived his arbitrary power from the passions of a turbulent camp. But in fact, the names both of Senate and people were little regarded amidst the excitement of personal contention. Caesar and Pompeius were now the real watchwords of parties, and even the children playing in the streets divided themselves, we are told, into Caesarians and Pompeians. Caesar, victorious everywhere by land, had made no effort, it would seem, to contest with his adversary the possession of the sea. He trusted to the rapidity of his movements and to the many chances of maritime enterprise to throw his forces across the narrow channel between Italy and Epirus, and evade or discomfit the flotillas opposed to him. He reached Brundisium, where he had collected a number of transports, and on the 4th of January, B.C. 48, 3 days from his leaving Rome, he embarked 7 legions amounting to 15,000 infantry and 600 cavalry. Bibulus, the commander of the Pompeian fleet, failed to intercept them, and could only attack and destroy the empty vessels on their return to receive a second division. Caesar had himself crossed over with the first, but he was not in a position to act with vigour until the arrival of Antonius with additional succours. He is said to have hastened in his impatience to bring over these reinforcements in person, and to have been driven back by a tempest in which he had with difficulty persuaded his trembling pilot to embark. "Fear not," he had exclaimed, "you carry Caesar and his fortunes." When indeed Antonius succeeded at last in crossing, he was wafted 100 miles below the point where his chief expected him, and Pompeius, who lay between, might easily, it should seem, have overpowered him. But most of the places on the coast had eagerly attached themselves to the cause of the assailant. The means of supply for the unwieldy hosts of the Senate were not, perhaps, easily attainable. Whatever was the cause of this delay, Caesar promptly took advantage of it. He was enabled to throw himself between Pompeius and his magazines at Dyrrhachium, and confine him to his secure position on the rocky promontory of Petra. Pompeius indeed felt little concern at this manoeuvre. He could occupy himself in training the loose and motley auxiliaries who had thronged to his standard, even while his adversary, with such inferior numbers, ventured to draw his lines around him. The confinement, however, of the great commander by his daring assailant could not fail to have a great moral effect, dispiriting his own friends and exalting the hopes and expectations of his enemies and of the populations which watched them far and near. After a time Pompeius found his situation become intolerable. He made a strenuous and well-directed attack upon his besiegers, broke their lines with his superior force, and drove them from before him. But Caesar had now secured a party in the heart of Greece and Macedonia, and thither he retreated, intending probably to fall upon Scipio, who was bringing succours to his son-in-law from the east. Pompeius hastened to follow him. The two rival captains dogged each other's steps from place to place, till at last they met in the valley of the Inopaeus, an effluent of the Peneus, on the plains of Pharsalia. The nobles in the senatorial camp had amused themselves with quarrelling about the expected spoils of the war, which they hoped to terminate with a triumphant victory. Cato was so shocked with their truculent threats that he sought a command which should detain him on the coast of Epirus, and Cicero, who had repaired once more to the side of Pompeius, now pleaded ill health and remained behind also. But the more sanguine spirits of the party still urged their chief to the battle from which he would fain have shrunk, nor could his officers bring him into the field, till Caesar threatened a flank movement which would have cut off his communications. Yet his army boasted a legionary force, fully 40,000 strong, with 7,000 horse, supported by a countless host of foreign allies, while Caesar had but 22,000 well-trained infantry and 1,000 cavalry, with a few irregular battalions. On August 9th, 48 BC, the Pompeians descended from their camp to the plain beneath, having the little stream of the Enopaeus on their right. Caesar hastened to the encounter, levelling the ramparts of his entrenchments to facilitate the egress of his troops in line of battle. Extending his cavalry on his right, he ordered his first line to charge, after halting just before they came within reach of their opponent's spears, to take breath for the final onset. The knights and senators who fought in the Pompeian ranks were equipped in complete armour, and the Caesarians were directed to waste no blows on their helms and corslets, but strike direct to their unprotected faces. Thus assailed, they soon broke their ranks, retreated, and fled, the support of the cavalry on their flanks having been baffled by Caesar's German horse. Pompeius had already abandoned the field, retiring to his camp at the first turn of fortune. There he would have rallied his troops and defended the works, but the routed battalions fled precipitately past him. The Caesarians pressed closely upon him and almost surprised him in his tent. Leaping on his horse at the last moment, he galloped swiftly away, escaping through the hinder gate, nor drew rein till he had reached Larissa. His discomfited battalions made a faint show of defence at a good position which they had assumed in the rear of their encampment, but dismayed by the flight of their commander, they soon gave way before the renewed attack of their indefatigable pursuers. It was Caesar's maxim to think nothing done while aught remained to do, and on this occasion he exemplified it to the utmost. he allowed his victorious soldiers no respite till the whole force of the Pompeians was utterly dispersed or reduced to capitulate before nightfall. A few only of the senators got away in the darkness. The battle of Pharsalia obtained, however, one honourable distinction in the annals of civil warfare. From the close of the day no more blood was shed. The fugitives were spared, and the captives received mercy. The victors lost only 30 centurions and 200, or as some stated, 1,200 legionaries. Of the vanquished there fell 10 senators, 40 knights, and 6,000 of all ranks of citizens. The slaughter among the foreign auxiliaries was probably much greater. Domitius was the only noble of distinction that perished. He was cut down in the flight by Caesar's cavalry. Many were captured, many also hastened to give themselves up to the conqueror, whose fame for clemency was now generally established. As he rode across the field of battle, he expressed his grief and perhaps his remorse at the sight of his countrymen's corpses. "They would have it so," he exclaimed. "After all my exploits I should have been lost, had I not thrown myself on the protection of my soldiers." Assuredly, this was true enough, whatever be the value of the excuse. The remnant of the vast army of the East was scattered far and wide. No reserve had been provided on the field, no place assigned for rallying at a distance. Even the naval force was dispersed or distant. Pompeius rushed through Larissa, hurried down the Vale of Tempe to the mouth of the Peneus, took ship on board a merchant vessel with a handful of attendants, and gained the island of Lesbos, whither he had removed his wife Cornelia. Running thence along the coast of Asia, he picked up a few of his adherents and held counsel with them, chiefly, it would seem, about his own personal safety. His first idea of seeking an asylum at the court of Parthia was indignantly overruled. To take refuge with the king of Egypt, a dependent of the Republic, was deemed both safer and less dishonourable. The wealth of Egypt was unbounded, its position well nigh inaccessible to an enemy destitute of a fleet. Ptolemaeus was young and doubtless timid. Possibly he might acknowledge a duty toward the Senate which had befriended him. Pompeius arrived off Pelusium with about 2,000 men, too few or too many for his safety. The court of Alexandria had well weighed the situation. Engaged as it was in a contest with Cleopatra, the king's sister, it discussed the claims of the Roman fugitive, but rejected his dangerous alliance. The victim was inveigled into a boat under pretense of being conveyed into the royal presence. He was murdered at a blow, and his head cut off to be presented to Caesar on his expected arrival. The body was flung into the surf, where it was picked up by a charitable hand and hastily consumed with fuel from a broken vessel. On the stone which covered the remains, the same hand inscribed with a blackened brand the illustrious name of Magnus. The history of Rome, fertile as it is in tragic issues, affords no more signal instance of a reverse of political fortune. But though Pompeius must fill next to Caesar the largest space on our canvas, his character was common and uninteresting, and his career, however splendid and dramatic, has left no such impress on the history of the times as that of his great rival, or even that of Cicero or of Cato. Pompeius had fled from the scene of his defeat, but the sea was closed against the conqueror by his naval armaments. Caesar was enabled indeed by the treachery of Gaius Cassius, who commanded in the straits, to throw himself across the Hellespont. But though the military forces of the Senate had dispersed in all directions and offered no resistance, he could not transport his own army into Asia, but was attended in his pursuit of Pompeius by no more than a single legion. In the Asiatic provinces, however, he was received with enthusiasm and forwarded on his way. Pompeius had gained no love throughout the ample regions he had conquered and organized. Caesar picked up a few vessels on the coast and presented himself with 4,000 men before the capital of the Ptolemies within a few days from the death of his rival. The king's ministers hastened to produce the head of the murdered man, but he turned from it with horror. Without a moment of delay or hesitation, he entered Alexandria in military array with the ensigns of a Roman imperator and consul. The populace was disturbed. Mercenary battalions composed of Greeks, Romans, and Asiatics, which maintained the unpopular throne of the Macedonian dynasty, were excited to quarrel with the Caesarians, and some encounters took place between them. Caesar required money. He seized on the person of the young king. He listened to the solicitations of the king's sister Cleopatra, who was intriguing against her brother, and required him to share his power with her. But the king's ministers who had offended her trembled for themselves. One of them, Pothinus, was arrested and put to death. But Achillas called the soldiers and citizens to arms, enclosed the intruding Roman in one quarter of the city, and reduced him to desperate straits, in the crisis of which he was obliged to swim for his life, with his commentaries, so said the legend, in one hand. In the course of his defense, Caesar fired the Egyptian fleet, and the flames consumed the great library of the museum with its 400,000 volumes. He consented at last to restore Ptolemais, but on the arrival of reinforcements from Syria, he was enabled to assume the offensive. He overthrew the royal army on the banks of the Nile, when Ptolemaeus himself perished in the stream. The Egyptians accepted Cleopatra for their queen at the command of the conqueror. End of section 15. Section 16 of the Roman Triumvirates by Charles Merivale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 7. The Civil War, Battle of Pharsalia, Death of Pompeius, Death of Cato, Part 3. We can hardly suppose that the great warrior and statesman allowed himself to be drawn into this perilous adventure by the charm, as has been commonly reported, of Cleopatra's beauty and accomplishments. More probably, he had fixed his eye on the treasures of Alexandria, the wealthiest city of the ancient world, to furnish him with the means he so much required, while he firmly abstained from the usual resource of plunder and confiscation. When at last his fortune extricated him from the struggle, he allowed himself indeed to remain 3 months longer to complete the advantage he had gained. As long as the Pompeians were still scattered, he lost little by postponing the prosecution of the war against them. He might even wish the disheartened remnant to gather head again, that he might once more strike them down at a blow. Meanwhile he made a campaign against Pharnaces, the son of Mithridates, who had profited by the general confusion to attack Deiotarus and Ariobarzanes. These eastern kings had been enrolled as allies of Pompeius, but they were dependents of the Republic also, and as such Caesar now undertook to defend them. Again, perhaps, he was in want of money. The assailant was easily defeated in the Battle of Zela, so speedily indeed that the victor, according to one story, could announce his success to the Senate in the 3 words, Veni, vidi, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. After regulating with all dispatch the affairs of the East, he hastened back to Italy, where his presence began to be required. The measures which the dictator had enacted for the adjustment of debts could not be universally acceptable. Many other causes of discontent were rife in the city and throughout Italy. Gaius, a clever intriguer who, like Curio before him, had deceived even Cicero by his pretensions to patriotism, excited disturbance at Rome. The consul Servilius, acting with firmness, caused him to be expelled from the Senate and declared incapable of public office. Thereupon he joined himself with Milo, who had crept out of his place of banishment and had armed his numerous gladiators in the south of Italy, and the two together raised a tumultuary force of outlaws and banditti. The sedition, however, was promptly suppressed, and both its leaders perished. It required a strong hand to maintain a secure and settled government amidst the perils which threatened it from within and from without. Doubtless the attachment of the citizens to Caesar was confirmed by the ferocious menaces of the Pompeians, which still reached them from a distance. Even the victory of Pharsalia could hardly avail to reassure them, while the conqueror was still plunging farther into the remote east, and the military forces of his enemy, supported by their powerful navy, were still accumulating in his rear. Nevertheless, his adherents removed the images of Pompeius and Sulla from the Forum, and his secret enemies were controlled by spies and required to join every demonstration of the general satisfaction. Then came the news of the death of Pompeius, attested by the exhibition of his ring to the citizens. Friends and enemies now combined to flatter the irresistible conqueror. Decrees were issued investing him with unlimited power to raise men and means for the suppression of the republicans who were again making head in Africa. In October BC 48, Caesar was created in his absence dictator by the Senate for the second time, while for the satisfaction of the people, the powers of the tribunate were decreed to him for life. He appointed Marcus Antonius his master of the horse and commandant in the city. Brave but violent and dissolute, Antonius lacked both sustained vigor and prudence. Sinister rumors began to circulate. Caesar was in peril at Alexandria. Sedition raised her head, and Antonius shrank from the risk of failure in attacking it. Disturbances were excited by Cornelius Dolabella, a weak profligate burdened with debts, a son-in-law of Cicero, who, like Caelius, raised the terrible cry of new tables, or an extinction of debts. Antonius summoned courage to suppress the tumult, but not till Dolabella had personally affronted him. The demagogue had got himself adopted into a plebeian house in order to obtain the tribuneship, and he was allowed to enjoy the legal inviolability with which the office invested him. In September BC 47, Caesar returned to Rome, and at once all men and all factions quailed before him. The traditions of the civil wars pointed to a barbarous proscription, but the clemency of Caesar was a star of hope to the citizens, and they were not disappointed in it. He was satisfied at least with seizing on the estates of the men who were still in arms against him, and with putting up to public sale the property of his great rival. The dictator remained only 3 months in Rome. He appointed consuls for the closing period of the year, and designated himself with Aemilius Lepidus for the year next ensuing. He caused himself to be again created dictator. The financial crisis had not yet passed, and doubtless a firm hand was required with competent powers to carry the commonwealth through it. He loaded his partisans with offices and honours, and sated the populace with largesses. This lavish expenditure of money seems to have been his chief means of government. But when his soldiers demanded the fulfilment of his golden promises, and his own favourite 10th Legion broke into mutiny, he sternly refused concession. Calling the soldiers together in the Campus Martius, he confronted them unattended, mounted his tribunal, and demanded the statement of their grievances. At the sight of their redoubted general, their hearts failed, their voices faltered. They could only plead piteously for their discharge. "I discharge you, citizens," replied the imperator. The effect of this last simple word was magical. To the fierce and haughty soldier, the peaceful title of citizen seemed a degradation. He entreated to be restored to his standards, and offered to submit to military punishment. This striking anecdote is often cited to show the military pride of the great nation of warriors, but it testifies more particularly to the effect of the long period of warfare to which the soldier had now been so commonly subjected, and to the scorn which the professional swordsman too often feels elsewhere than in Rome for the name and character of civilian. The veterans of Camillus, of Scipio, perhaps even of Marius, would not have disdained to be addressed as Roman citizens. Thus reassured of the force and temper of the weapon he wielded, Caesar hastened away to crush the gathering of his enemies, assembled in the province of Africa. The defeated host had been scattered at Pharsalia in many directions, but the largest division of the fugitives had made its way to Dyrrachium, and had there taken breath to concert its further movements. Cato, to whom the command was offered, waived it in favour of Cicero, the consular and the proconsul. But the orator declined to engage further in a struggle which he regarded as hopeless, and withdrew sorrowfully into Italy. Gnaeus, the violent son of Pompeius, would have laid hands upon him, and he was glad to throw himself at last on Caesar's clemency. Thereupon Scipio assumed the command and carried the main body to Utica. Cato, at the head of another division, skirted the coasts of Greece and Asia, picking up some fleeing adherents of the cause. He followed in the track of Pompeius, but when informed of his chief's assassination, he landed on the shore of Libya and demanded admission into Cyrene. The natives shut their gate, but Cato respected their fears and refrained from chastising them. Anxious now to effect a junction with Scipio, he coasted westward as far as the Lesser Syrtis, and then plunged with his little army into the sandy desert. The march through this torrid and trackless region occupied 7 days, and was celebrated as an act of chivalrous endurance, which might raise the character of Cato above that of many victorious and triumphant imperators. The object of undertaking it is hard to comprehend. But in this, as in many other details of Roman military history, we must allow for our imperfect knowledge of the means available for the operations in hand. On joining the bulk of the Republican forces in the Roman province, Cato was indignant at the position of his colleagues in command. Scipio had sought the aid of Juba, king of Numidia, an ally and hitherto a dependent of the Republic. But this prince had seized the opportunity to exalt his own importance, and presumed on the large resources he could bring, as well as on his recent services to the cause, in his defeat of Curio, to take the first place in the Republican councils. Cato was glad to escape from this humiliation by accepting a local command at Utica, the chief place in the province and the principal port for communications with Italy. Nor were his friends less willing to be relieved from his importunate susceptibilities. For a time, perhaps, they felt themselves secure from Caesar's pursuit, for Caesar was still deficient in naval resources. They forgot the loss of their great army and their still greater chief, and flattered themselves that victory was still in their hands. Labienus, the renegade, had now become their chief military adviser, while Scipio was surrounded by Afranius, Petreius, the sons of Pompeius, and other leaders of the party, all abundantly confident in themselves and loud in denunciation of their enemy. But their military capacity was slender. Of political vision they had none at all. Such was the posture of affairs in the Republican camp when Caesar suddenly appeared off the coast with the small division of his troops for which he could secure means of transport, having evaded the vigilance of Scipio's fleet. He summoned the leaders of the force at Adrumetum to surrender to Caesar the imperator. They replied, "There is no imperator here but Scipio," and put his herald to death as a deserter. The dictator sailed on to Leptis, and landing there with the goodwill of the inhabitants, awaited further succours. There he was menaced by Scipio, and Labienus, who frequently led the opposing cavalry, flung bitter taunts at the veterans whom he had so often led to victory. But Caesar maintained himself quietly within his entrenchments till he could move forward with 5 legions, while by making an alliance with the Mauritanians he was enabled to drive away Juba to the defence of his own capital. Scipio had no spirit to combat him alone. The Republican force drew off, Caesar advanced, and was rapidly gaining the upper hand. After a time, Juba rejoined his friends and made them feel that they had become more than ever dependent upon him. He forbade Scipio to wear the imperator's purple cloak, which pertained, he said, to kings only. At last, on April 4th, the armies met on the field of Thapsus. Some of Caesar's troops were fresh levies, and he was not sure of their steadiness. But the impetuosity of the redoubted 10th Legion forced on the battle, and carried the imperator along with it. Caesar invoked his wonted good fortune, and spurring his horse took the lead of his battalions. The combat was soon decided. The Numidian elephants turned upon the ranks which they were placed to cover. The native cavalry, dismayed at the loss of their accustomed support, hastened to abandon the field. Scipio's legions made little resistance. Separated from their fleeing officers, they begged for quarter, but a frightful massacre was made of them which Caesar was unable to control. Scipio, escaping to the coast, was taken and slain. Juba and Petreius fled together and sought refuge in Zama, but the Numidians refused shelter to their tyrant and his companion. Thus repulsed, the fugitives first ate and drank together, then, in the spirit of barbarian gladiators, challenged each other to mortal combat. Petreius was first to fall in the duel. Juba threw himself on his own sword. Cato was now left to defend himself alone in Africa. His own course had been long decided, but he allowed his followers to choose for themselves between submission or flight or resistance to the utmost. The senators and knights, despairing, it is said, of pardon, would have held out, but the traders and men of peace, long settled in Utica, had little to fear from yielding and insisted on a timely surrender. Cato closed all the gates except that which opened upon the port, and urged his associates to take to the sea. With his son and a few devoted friends who refused to leave him, he sat down to supper on the eve of Caesar's arrival. He discoursed with more than his usual fervour on the highest themes of philosophy, especially on the generous paradox of the Stoics, that the good man alone is free, and all the bad are slaves. Meanwhile the embarkation was proceeding. Cato sent repeatedly to inquire who had already put to sea, and what were the prospects of the voyage. Retiring to his chamber, he took up the Dialogue on the Soul, in which Plato has recorded his dying master's last longing for immortality. Looking up, he observed that his sword had been removed. He sent for his friends, rebuked them for their unworthy precaution, as if he said he might not at any time kill himself by dashing his head against the wall, or merely by holding his breath. Reassured perhaps for a moment by the calmness of his demeanour, they restored him his weapon, and at his earnest desire left him once more alone. At midnight he inquired again about the departure of his followers. The last vessel, it was replied, was just leaving the quay. He then threw himself on his couch, but when all was quiet, he seized his sword and thrust it into his body. The blow was not immediately mortal, and he rolled groaning on the floor. His attendants rushed in, a surgeon sewed up the gash. But on coming to himself, he repulsed his disconsolate friends, and tearing open the wound, expired with the same dogged resolution which through life had distinguished him. There is something so Roman, and at the same time so peculiar, in the character of this hero of ancient history, that a few words may well be bestowed on a special notice of it. Cato of Utica, as he is commonly called, to distinguish him from his great-grandfather, Cato the Censor, inherited from his ancestor the rugged disposition of the Sabine Highlanders. He was naturally harsh in temper, quaint in humor, strict in the discharge of duties interpreted in a narrow sense, enduring much himself and exacting no less of others. The elder Cato had struggled through life resisting the influence of Grecian ideas which he deemed wholly pernicious, though in his latest years he had deigned at last to make himself acquainted with the Greek language. His descendant, after the lapse of a century, had yielded altogether to the new lights which had pervaded his country, and had received at least the outward polish of the literature and philosophy of the schools. The time had in fact just arrived when the more sensitive and sanguine spirits at Rome were beginning to throw off the blind devotion of a ruder age to mere form and ceremonial, and look into their own hearts for the moral resources which had become necessary to them. Cato himself was a religious enthusiast, but he was, in Roman phrase, full of the god within his own breast, and retained no external object of belief. From the time of Plato, at least, the philosophers of Greece had taught men to look into their own hearts for the rule of spiritual life. It was but recently that this subjective idea of religion had been introduced into Rome, where it met with little intelligent acceptance. For the most part, those among the Romans who most readily rejected the creed of antiquity cast themselves on the tenets of the Epicureans, which were, in fact, a mere negation of religion altogether. Those who, like Cato, embraced the system of the Stoics were even more rigid and pedantic in their notions than their masters, and of these none was more eminent for the strictness of his rule and his devotion to his principle than the philosophic statesman who gave up his life for his faith at Utica. Cato died for his religion as much as any martyr of the heathen or the Christian world, for he held it as a religious duty to maintain the constitution of his country, but the error or vice of his system was that he acknowledged no duty to any being exterior to himself, to whom he owed his existence, and for whom he was bound to support it. According to the severe logic of his false philosophy, when the Republic had perished, his own work, though left undone, was, as far as he was concerned, practically finished. There was now no further place for him in life. Wherefore he bowed to his destiny and quitted it without a murmur. The melancholy result of this error was that the pupils of Cato's school elevated it into a principle, and Seneca and others both defended and followed it. End of section 16.